Did Ukrainian forces actually invade Russia?
Well, yes. We'll make it simple. They crossed the border in the Kursk region. It was lightly defended by Russia, but this is being played to the propaganda hilt, because the reaction of both the Ukrainian authorities and, most importantly, the U.S. news media, the U.S. think tanks. My God, they're celebrating this like it was that they're Germans, and this was the start of the Battle of the Bulge. Oh, we're sweeping the Americans from the field. They're taking over Russia. Russia's on its heels. It's the most absurd thing I think we've seen in the course of this entire war, because it looks like the total force that the Ukrainians launched across the border was maybe 2,000 men, possibly 3,000. What's worth noting is that the Russians killed at least 1,500 of those within the first 2 days. So it's not exactly like they're rolling to victory. This has been a PR win, but it's really it has a short shelf life. The expiration date on it, I think, was on Sunday, because their original goal, it appears, was to get close to the nuclear power plant in Kursk and maybe even take control of it. They failed to do that. What we've learned is that the Russians are very effective at quickly mobilizing and deploying their personnel to the scene. And they're slaughtering the Ukrainians. That's the simple fact.
Here's President Putin, excuse me, President Zelensky boasting about all of this, Larry. Cut number 3, Chris. Our friend and colleague Scott Ritter has been very much in the news, a little bit in the mainstream media, but in the alternative media where we live, very extensively, because he's a hero to many millions of people. And his home was the subject of the execution of a vast search warrant by the FBI last week. I had asked you if you thought that Scott was courageous, and you responded yes. And then I saw you do an interview elsewhere with some really moving and articulate comments about Scott. Talk to us, please, about the personal courage you have observed in this man, and whether you think the federal government will succeed in keeping him from criticizing them.
Well, on the latter point, Judge, there's no chance that the federal government will keep Scott from telling the truth. And if that's criticizing the federal government, so be it. I think his very sharp criticism of Netanyahu was something that really turned people off, and may have been the proximate cause of something that they've been prepared to do for a long time. I also note in passing that many of our veteran intelligence professionals for sanity have had their houses raided, ransacked, and never got back their tapes or their computers. 4 of the last one, the ones that signed our last VIPS memo, I had that happen to them. I count about 7 altogether at VIPS. So this is new for Bill. New for Binny, new for Scott, correction, but not new for VIPS. What I said about Scott was that
because their populations are enraged, the Turks are enraged. The one place where people are not as enraged, interestingly enough, is Iran. And the Iranian leadership, despite whatever you may hear publicly, desperately wants to avoid a war with Israel, primarily because they don't want to go to war with us.
Last subject matter, Colonel. Was there recently some military activity by the Houthis, which resulted in about 70 deaths of IDF and some American contractors, about which you can tell us?
Well, I can tell you only what I found through open source material. I haven't seen anything classified, but I am reliably told that roughly 70 Israeli so-called commandos or special forces, special operations force types, along with some number of Americans. The total number was 70. How many were Israeli and how many were American mercenaries that were joined in this operation? I don't know what the exact breakdown was, but it was obviously mostly Israeli. And they infiltrated successfully into Yemen, but they were tracked from the moment they infiltrated by overhead satellites, presumably Russian. And the Russians provided this information to the Iranians, who immediately telegraphed it to the Houthis. And whatever you say about the Houthis is that they're tough hombres on the battlefield. They set up an ambush and they killed all of them. And there is footage of the dead. And I haven't had a chance to examine it carefully, but clearly most of it's Israeli, but there are indisputably some American mercenaries there. There may be some Brits mixed into it who are also employees of the same contract firm. Now, this is something very important for everybody listening to understand. Persistent surveillance today changes everything in warfare. It not only enables precision strike on a scale that has never been the case in the past, it makes it impossible for forces to infiltrate into regions without being discovered. It makes so-called surprise attacks on the scale of Pearl Harbor an impossibility. We don't really want to come to terms with that in the United States. We continue to look at forces from the vantage point of the Second World War and the distant past. Those days are over. You can't cross the Atlantic with impunity. You can't do very much of anything without being detected. So the point is that this is a wake-up call, not just for the Israelis or the contractors who are part of this, but this should be a wake-up call for all of us. And we need to take it very, very seriously, because the only way to wage war in this setting is to disrupt the space-based reconnaissance, intelligence, and surveillance. When you do that, the game changes, and you're really in full-blown war. Then you have to have the ability to rapidly recover from the loss of your satellites through other redundant means. The Israelis understand that, and they're probably prepared for it. We are not. And that's really what we should take from this. And we should not continue to underestimate these militias. They're very deadly organizations.
Parallel with this Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk area, that in both cases, apparently the US were surprised and even disagree with the idea of striking directly on the Iranian territory, and as well as this offensive in Ukraine, meaning that we see that the US understands that it starts to lose control over its allies. And this has a consequence, is that the US doesn't want to be dragged into an open conflict, both in Ukraine and in Israel. They have a political support because they claim to have that. That's also the reason why, by the way, Benjamin Netanyahu went to Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. That was precisely to make sure that this political support exists and that he can count on this support. So the political support is there, but no physical support. In terms of the objectives of the U.S., even if they deploy a new naval battle groups in the area, both on the Persian Gulf side and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, I feel that these deployments are probably more like muscle flexing than preparedness for effective commitment on the ground, and probably a little bit more with the idea of dissuasion, to dissuade any attack, or let's say concerted attack against Israel. But the objective, in my view, I may be wrong on that, but that's a feeling I have, considering what we have in the media, especially US media. My feeling is that the objective of the Biden administration is probably to have a success, a political success